Hello, and welcome to the Europe at War podcast. Episode 3.11, the 29th of April. In the early hours of the 29th of April, the inhabitants of the Führerbunker were treated to one last mad display, in the form of Adolf Hitler's wedding to his longtime sweetheart, Eva Braun. Hitler knew his time was short, so given the betrayals of Göring and Himmler over the past few days, Hitler had decided to reward the unwavering loyalty which had been shown to him by Eva Braun by promoting her to the official rank of wife, a title she had desired for years. Of course, Hitler could have spent his final hours on Earth conducting surrender negotiations with the Soviets just down the road from his bunker to, save the lives of thousands of soldiers pointlessly fighting in a battle which the Germans had basically already lost. But hey, what can I say? Hitler was just head over heels in love, I guess. There was one positive upshot to the wedding, however, in that a local Gauamtleiter by the name of Walter Wagner was called in to officiate the ceremony, thus giving him a brief respite from the fighting he had been engaged in as a member of a frontline Volkssturm unit. That was nice. After the wedding was completed, the bride and groom did the obvious thing a freshly happily married couple would do. They planned their suicide. When news of Mussolini's arrest and summary execution reached the bunker on the 29th of April, Hitler became terrified that he might suffer the same humiliating fate which had befallen Mussolini and his mistress, because once they had been shot by Italian partisans, their bodies had been strung up on a lamppost in a central square in Milan. In contrast, Hitler was determined to go out on his own terms, and he had chosen a much classier way for him and Eva to meet their end, namely cyanide capsules and a pistol. Whilst Hitler and Eva had been getting hitched in the depths of the Führerbunker, the Soviets had pressed on with their assaults. To the north of the Citadella district, the 3rd Shock Army's 79th Rifle Corps continued their attack across the Moltkebridge, and by now a small group of Soviet troops had successfully crossed the bridge and established a modest bridgehead on the German side of the river. However, this isolated group was facing constant machine gun and artillery fire from the German troops stationed in the government buildings in front of them, so they were unable to expand the bridgehead. And it was only when supporting units from the 150th and 171st Rifle Divisions swarmed across the bridge that a strong Soviet bridgehead could be properly secured. Here, the Rifle Divisions were crucial in taking the fight to the Germans, engaging in brutal close-quarters combat as they advanced upon the German defensive positions in the buildings. The first key building to fall was the Prussian Ministry of the Interior, and the Soviet riflemen threw grenades into the building as they charged through the front door. Running battles lasted all day between the SS defenders and the Soviet attackers, with firefights breaking out on the staircase, along the corridors, and throughout every floor. And only once extra Russian reinforcements entered the fray to support the assault was the German resistance in the building finally crushed. To limit their exposure to sniper fire and machine gun fire, the Soviet infantry started mouse-holing from one building into the next in order to push the attack forward and root out the German troops occupying each building in the diplomatic quarter. The crossing over the Moltkebridge had been a resounding success, and by dawn, all infantry units had made it across, with engineers clearing the way for Soviet armor to follow, and to underline the fact that this was the endgame, Soviet artillery then started pounding the Reichstag itself to soften up the defences there for the next stage of the assault. In the assault on the eastern edge of the citadella, the 26th Guards Rifle Corps from the 5th Shock Army attacked the Rotes Rathaus, the home of the Berlin State Parliament. The thick red brick walls of the building offered another fantastic defensive position for the Germans, and only when tanks and self-propelled guns blasted holes into the walls of the building were the Soviet riflemen able to enter inside. Hand-to-hand combat reminiscent of trench warfare broke out as the Germans and Soviets fought in smoke-filled rooms and corridors throughout the building. Meanwhile, just to the south of the Rotes Rathaus, the 32nd and 9th Rifle Corps, also from the 5th Shock Army, were engaged in a deadly slugging match against the Nordland Panzergrenadier Division and other Waffen-SS units as they inched closer towards the Reichschancellery. In order to hold back the Red Army from reaching the Reichschancellery, the Nordland Division sent out new groups of tank hunters armed with Panzerfausts to knock out the Soviet armour. Here, the French SS volunteers, under the command of Henry Fenet, once again proved their loyalty to the international fascist cause by way of their impressive tank hunting skills. And it's claimed that the French SS men knocked out around half of the 108 Soviet tanks which were destroyed in the Citadella district. Numerous French fighters were decorated for their tank hunting exploits, with SS Brigadeführer Krukenberg awarding one of the Battle of Berlin's final Knight's Crosses to a Frenchman called Eugene Vallot, who single-handedly destroyed 8 tanks in less than 24 hours. Whilst these exploits were impressive, all notion of pomp and ceremony had long since departed the battle, as the medal ceremony was conducted by candlelight in Krukenberg's Railway Car Command HQ. The foreign SS volunteers were a vital aspect of the Berlin garrison, and as the Russians were closing in on the heart of the city, and even on the Führerbunker itself, these foreign SS fighters were turning out to be the most effective and most highly motivated defenders left on the front line. Their desire to keep fighting was fueled by their intense hatred of Bolshevism, for sure. But in many cases, the foreign SS volunteers also knew that they were likely to be convicted of treason back in their homelands, with the very real threat of execution hanging over their heads. They thus saw no alternative than to keep fighting, even though the Nazi regime and Berlin itself was falling apart around them. And if they died, so be it. Better to die with a Panzerfaust in your hand than with a noose around your neck. But despite the success of the French tank busters, they were only able to provide morale-boosting victories at best, as the destruction of a few dozen tanks was not going to turn the tide of the battle. And try as hard as they could, they weren't holding back the unrelenting advance of the Red Army. In the earlier stages of the battle, the Soviets had been slightly more methodical in their approach to street fighting when advancing through the outer line districts of Berlin. However, by the time they reached the Citadella district, the fanatical opposition they were facing was causing such high casualty rates that the Red Army quickly threw all caution to the wind. From now on, they didn't really give a damn as to how they crushed the enemy. For instance, when the Soviets came across defensive barricades, they plowed through them with their tanks, or they destroyed them at point-blank range with a hail of tank fire. Similarly, if German snipers dared fire upon Red Army troops, then Soviet tanks simply obliterated the building the sniper had been firing from. In another sign that the Red Army was determined to make the Germans pay a bloody price for their continuing stubborn defense the Red Army installed thousands of artillery pieces and Katyusha rocket launchers in every available open space in Berlin, such as on the recently captured Tempelhof airfield, in public parks, or even in residential gardens. As soon as these guns were in place, they were used to rain a continuous barrage of phosphorus shells into the Citadella district, which set whole neighborhoods ablaze. Whilst the Red Army tightened the screws on the Berlin garrison forces to the north and to the east of the Citadella district, to the south, meanwhile, General Chuikov's forces finally launched their epic crossing of the Landwehr Canal. To begin the assault, heavy guns unleashed an apocalyptic barrage, wiping out huge swathes of the German forces stationed on the northern bank of the canal. Once the shelling stopped, Soviet riflemen crossed the canal. Most of them crossed using boats or makeshift rafts. Many riflemen, however, opted to simply swim across. Meanwhile, shock troops charged the heavily defended Potsdamer Bridge, advancing under a thick smokescreen, hoping to capture the last remaining intact bridge over the canal. In the assault on the bridge, combat engineers immediately went to work trying to deactivate the various mines which had been laid by the Germans, along with the two large aerial mines which had been suspended from the bridge. Under the constant harassment of German machine gun fire, the engineers managed to deactivate all of the mines, suffering heavy losses in the process. With the mines neutralized, a phalanx of T-34s was called up to lead an armored charge over the bridge, and the tanks were also desperately needed to provide cover for the infantry, who were being torn to pieces by the Germans. The exteriors of the tanks were kitted out in the latest in Soviet battlefield technology, such as sandbags, bed springs, and sheet metal, all of which provided a surprisingly good countermeasure to the German Panzerfausts. But whilst these ingenious defences protected the tanks from rocket fire, they could do little to withstand the heavy shells being fired at them by a dug-in Tiger tank on the opposite end of the bridge. To counteract the fire from the Tiger tank, the Russians ordered more supporting artillery fire to target the German positions, whilst further smokescreens were also deployed to mask the approach of small groups of Soviet riflemen who were then able to cross the bridge successfully. However, the final Soviet breakthrough on the Potsdamer Bridge was achieved thanks to a crafty piece of subterfuge. In a flash of brilliance, the Soviets decided to douse one of their tanks in flammable oil, and then they set it alight. This was in order to give the tank the appearance that it had been knocked out. This tank, which still possessed a full tank crew inside operating the controls, then slowly crossed the bridge and drove straight towards the enemy lines. The Germans, thinking it was just another knocked-out tank driving aimlessly but harmlessly over the bridge, ignored the tank and they didn't fire upon it. As soon as the tank made it across the bridge, however, it immediately sprang to life and started firing point-blank at the German defenders, including the dug-in Tiger tank. The Germans were stunned, and in their confusion, more Soviet T-34s ploughed across the bridge, overrunning the German positions. And thus, after a morning of heavy fighting and horrendous losses for the Soviets, they were now in full control of the Potsdamer Bridge. General Chukov wasted no time in flooding more of his forces across the bridge in order to exploit the breakthrough, and soon his lead elements were at the southern edge of the Tiergarten Park, only a few hundred meters from the Brandenburg Gate. Elsewhere along the Landwehr Canal, General Chukov's infantry units were crossing the canal and reaching the northern embankment. But as the Soviet riflemen clambered up the embankment, they were met by a hail of German defensive fire from concealed artillery and machine gun emplacements, which had been hidden within the half-destroyed buildings and mounds of rubble on the German side of the canal. Many of these guns had gone unnoticed by the Soviets, so when infantry units reached the other side of the canal, they were ambushed by the guns and riflemen were slaughtered in droves. To overcome this new threat, infantry was sent to crawl through some sewers, and once they were through, they popped up right in the middle of the German defensive positions. Taken completely off guard by the sudden appearance of Red Army soldiers, the Germans were either butchered or fled. With the northern side of the Landwehr Canal now firmly under Soviet control, General Chukov's forces pushed on, seizing the Muckenbrucker U-Bahnhof and the Belle-Alliance Platz. Whilst First Belarusian Front forces advanced onto the centre of Berlin from the north, east and south, Marshal Konyev's First Ukrainian Front, which had been excluded from the final assault on the Reichstag after the redrawing of the demarcation line the previous day, was relegated to proceeding with its objective of clearing out German resistance to the west of the city centre, in the areas of Charlottenburg, Wilmersdorf, and Westend. For instance, the 3rd Guards Tank Army spent the 29th of April fighting fierce battles in their drive to reach the important Kurfürstendamm Street. Here, the objective was to take control of the important thoroughfare, as that would then enable the tank army to take a flanking approach towards the imposing flak tower at Zoo, in order to engage the remaining Berlin garrison troops holding out in the flak tower. With the Red Army closing in on the Zitadella district from all directions, the only thing that would save the Berlin garrison forces would be the long-promised miraculous counterattack from General Wenck's 12th Army. But today was the day when General Wenck finally informed German High Command that his forces would not be marching onto Berlin to save the German troops and civilians trapped in the capital. For on the evening of the 29th, Wenck messaged Field Marshal Keitel at OKW to inform him that whilst his 12th Army had reached the village of Ferch, south of Potsdam, they could go no further. Wenck explained how the Soviets were launching increasingly powerful attacks on his flanks. Thus his 12th Army was being forced to concentrate wholly on defensive actions all along its front. This meant that Wenck's army was in no state to launch an attack on the Soviet forces assaulting Berlin. Keitel received Wenck's message, and despite making one final attempt at guilt-tripping Wenck by outlining his moral and historical duty of saving Berlin, Keitel reluctantly acknowledged that Wenck was indeed unable to launch any offensive action towards the capital. Whilst General Wenck was now off the hook, he did try radioing General Weidling's headquarters, informing him that he and his Berlin garrison troops should attempt a breakout in order to link up with the 12th Army. But Wenck received no reply. Given the dire state of communications in Berlin, it's highly unlikely General Weidling even received the message. In any case, Wenck wasn't going to stick around, and he immediately redeployed his entire 12th Army to the area around Belitz in order to link up with whatever remained of General Busse's 9th Army. But for Berlin, well, that was that. There was to be no epic counterattack from Wenck's army, and as a result, the capital of the Third Reich was going to fall to the Soviets. Therefore, by the end of the 29th of April, the situation was as follows. The ferocity of the Soviet attacks was forcing the Berlin garrison forces to fall back in all directions. And now, with no hope of rescue from Wenck, it was only a matter of time before the remaining German troops in Berlin were killed or captured by the Red Army. General Weidling summed up the hopeless situation when he wrote the following: "Catastrophe was inevitable if the Führer did not reverse his decision to defend Berlin to the last man, especially if he sacrificed all who were still alive and fighting in the city for the sake of a crazy ideal. We racked our brains to see how we could avoid this fate. Surely the Führer must realize that even the bravest soldier cannot fight without ammunition. The struggle was devoid of sense or purpose." So to conclude this week's episode, the end was near. The Russians now stood only a few hundred meters away from the Führer bunker. The Reichstag was about to be subjected to a colossal assault from waves of Soviet infantry and tanks. The Berlin garrison troops were quickly running out of ammunition. Berliners were trapped in tunnels and cellars, hiding from the bombs and hiding from Red Army soldiers. And Hitler was preparing to put a bullet through his head. The stage was thus set for the finale in the battle for Berlin. Thank you for listening to the Europe at War podcast. If you're enjoying the show and want to stay up to date with all the latest episodes, don't forget to hit that follow or subscribe button. You can also help spread the word by leaving a rating or review on your favorite podcast platform. It really makes a difference and helps more people discover the show. And if you like what I do, why not consider becoming a Patreon supporter? In doing so, you will help keep the podcast marching forward. To find out all the details, please check out patreon.com/Europe at War. Thank you.